together and we'll open with a word of prayer. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. That usually works. Let us pray. Be present, O Christ, with your servants here as we seek your wisdom, your grace, your love, your courage, your forbearance, and in all that we might glorify God and serve you by serving others. We ask it all in your name. Amen. Well, thank you all for being here. You should have two handouts. One is just a copy of the slides that I'll have, and I've got more copies up here if someone doesn't have one. I put some on the tables. And the second one, don't need to worry about it just yet. The one that says Egypt and Empire on the front, we'll get to that a little bit later on, and we'll actually be using that through the course of the series. So does everyone have both? You need which ones? Here. Susan or Mary can I just grab some. Great, thank you. So Mary's got extra copies here of both if you need them. So what I want to say at the beginning is that leadership, in my opinion, is not some external philosophy to which one assents. It's not an external set of tenets or a framework or a set of skills that one puts on like you would clothing. And over time, the clothing helps inform. I think that that's a myth of leadership that's been taught in many cases, especially in the last 30 years in relation to organizational design, that it's somehow an external thing that we take on. And what I would suggest is that there are skills to be honed for sure, and we can learn, obviously, there's precepts to be learned and integrated into our lives, but this work that we're talking about tonight and for the next several weeks is more about leaning into one's true self. And then with authenticity, it's how we relate with others and lead others. So what we're really talking about is a way of being, which is why we've entitled the class or the series Spirituality and Leadership, because it's about the deep inner work. In fact, I'll begin with this quote by Parker Palmer, who says, "New leadership is needed for new times, but it will not come from finding new and more wily ways to manipulate the external world. It will come as we who lead find the courage to take an inward journey toward both our shadow and our light, a journey that, faithfully pursued, will take us beyond ourselves to become healers of a wounded world." And I believe that everyone is called to lead in this way. And I'm so glad that you all are here. So we have 6 weeks in the series over a 7-week period, because 2 weeks from tonight, Red Letter Day, Ash Wednesday in the life of the church, March 1st. And so we won't have class that night. But let me just hit highlight here of tonight. We'll do some overview and first steps. We'll look at the notion of paradigm shift. Next week we will talk principally from an article, an essay written by Parker Palmer, and I have copies here for you before you leave. It's entitled Leading from Within. The next week is Ash Wednesday. The next week we'll talk about temptations. Here we are in Lent, we have to talk about temptations, right? And then on March 15th we'll look at how Enneagram applications find their way into this work of spirituality and leadership. Leadership in particular, and servant leadership is the language I'm going to use here in just a moment. That March 15th is right on the heels of an Enneagram workshop that we're offering here Friday night, March 10th, and Saturday, March 11th. That does require pre-registration. There is a fee associated with it, There is scholarship available. If you need that, just talk to me about that. But we hope that folks will engage that Enneagram workshop, which will then inform how we relate with one another about the Enneagram the next night. It's not required, but encouraged. And then March 22nd, change and chaos and resilience and recovery. And then March 29th, the real self and reality versus fear and fear of transformation. What we're really talking about here is servant leadership. I know that term, especially in this diocese, has got some baggage. When I got here and I suggested that I wanted to have a servant leadership school, something along the lines of what we're now doing with Wisdom School, and folks let me know there's some history, there's some darkness associated with that term, but I would like to reclaim that phrase, servant leadership, if we can, because I believe it is central to our religious tradition. We are all called to be servant leaders. I think that all humanity is called to this. I believe we all have the capacity for it. I'm trying to make that case through the course of this evening. And by thinking in terms of servant leadership, or if that just won't work for you, then spirituality and leadership, it orients us differently. Not just to a task at hand as a leader, but to how we live and move and have our being. And we're able to do so less narcissistically, which in my estimation is one of the great temptations, if we're going to use that language, of our modern time. Narcissism is. It does so even while servant leadership is really about the deep inner work about which Parker Palmer taught. So notions like rugged individualism, American individualism, consumerism, commodification of all aspects of our lives, those are all rabbit holes that the world, the consumeristic world, is trying to convince us that leadership is one more element of that commodification, which has to do with how we have power and how we gain prestige, how we get honored versus shamed, how we accumulate possessions, and even more. We'll talk more about that as the evening goes. But what do we mean by servant? I understand that this has a negative connotation given the historical oppression of workers, especially people of color and gender challenges there. But Juana Bordas offers this in an article that she wrote, Pluralistic Reflections on Servant Leadership. She says, servant leadership has very old roots in many indigenous cultures. Cultures that were holistic, cooperative, communal, intuitive, and spiritual. Those are the elements about which we are talking tonight. These cultures centered on being guardians of the future, how they relayed from one generation into the next through leadership. And 21st century leadership philosophy attributes, the attributes are related to service, servanthood, which are historically feminine. I'm not talking female here or woman role. I'm talking feminine characteristic, but are increasingly seen as positive qualities for leaders regardless of gender. All right? If that unsettles you a little bit, just hang tight. So then what do we mean by leader? So here are some presuppositions, and we can debate this over time, but every person, I believe, has the capacity to lead. If we are created in God's image, we are co-creative in our experience of our life, of life. And if we are co-creative, then we have the capacity to lead. Culturally, we've made leadership more about power and authority than about relationality, and we're talking about putting that, just doing the 180 on that altogether. Again, Parker Palmer, a leader is a person who has an unusual degree of power to project on other people his or her shadow or his or her light. A leader is a person who must take special responsibility for what's going on inside of him or herself, inside his or her consciousness, lest the act of leadership create more harm than good. We all know leaders who've done more harm than good, right? Right? Nervous laughter there?
I really agree with leaders.
What's that?
Are they really leaders?
Well, so it's a good question, Karin. The question is, are they really leaders? And I would maintain that they are, but they're exercising the dark side of the leadership. And we'll talk more about that next week with Leading from Within, this article by Parker Palmer that I commend to you. The truth is that when we're talking about the good or the not so good, the harmful, if we're talking about the dark, the shadow or the light, we're talking about each of us and every other person, because there is no one who is perfect in this. We all have the capacity. We all have done it. We all will do it. Every person will. No one is perfect, but this isn't about perfection. It's about authenticity unfolding into relationship, which is life-giving, in which the leader invites others into the experience of goodness, of life, and of wholeness. I hope that you hear, those of you who have been coming to these series that I've been teaching, with Brene Brown and with Human Flourishing and the T.S. Eliot, I hope you hear some of the resonant language, the vocabulary that we've been using, because it all is of the same language. So servant leadership then, if we put it together, we're talking about leading from within. We're talking about the spiritual journey that unfolds into authenticity. And it's a series that's just designed not as a deductive or reductive toward a set of principles, but rather it's inductive and it's narrative. We are going to live our narrative drawing on the innate gifts that we believe as people of faith are bestowed upon us by our Creator, who claimed it and us as good, claimed it very good. And so we're going to lean into these attributes of creativity and compassion and this desire for communion, which are quintessential elements. It's a narrative that invites us to trust, to vulnerability. You hear the echoes of Brene Brown here and others, of abundance, of surrender, or the churchy term is kenosis, this self-emptying for the benefit of others. And it's about being receptive. In the end, it's about practicing presence. Now, I suspect some of you are thinking, I thought I was going to get Leadership 101 here. So for those who are needing just a bit more structure at this moment, more systematic approach to all of this, here's a list of 10 characteristics put forth by Robert Greenleaf, the servant as leader. You all know Robert Greenleaf's name, surely. Been around for a long time. I'm not going to hit all these. This is one model or approach to it. It's not the model we're going to take in this. All right? There is another way, but it requires a paradigm shift. A paradigm shift. And that's a phrase that I think is thrown around a lot these days, and I'm not sure that we all know what is meant by that, or it could be a real spectrum of what's meant by that. But I want us to be very clear about what we mean by that in the context of spirituality and leadership here. All right? So, Albert Einstein. This is my favorite photo of the guy. He knew how to have fun even while he was doing all of his thought experiments. He was a master of thought experiments where he considered new ways of thinking about the universe. But he said, this is all a slippery slope. When we get into the thought experiment, we then create it in our own image and we can't get out of it so easily. This is the quote from him, that a human being is part of the whole of what we call the universe, a part limited in time and space, right? We know that to be our mortal existence. We experience ourselves, our thoughts and feelings, as something separate from the rest. But he said, that is just an optical illusion of consciousness. Does that stop you short? But it's there. Does it make sense? That we are part of the whole, but we think that we're separated because we're able to think. We think, therefore we are. Not we are part of the universe, therefore we think. This illusion is a kind of prison for us, Einstein said. restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for those closest to us, because it's all about what's internalized, about what we can control. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening circles of compassion. We'll just hold that thought for a bit, because it will unfold in a different way here in a few moments. But I want to now try to unpack paradigm. And this is the only, I think, a little bit heady part of the thing and a little bit tedious, so just bear with me on the next couple of slides. I thought the word paradigm has been around for centuries. Just assume that it was. But it really wasn't part of the lexicon until 1962, when Thomas Kuhn first wrote The Structure of Scientific Revolutions and used this term paradigm to describe the mental models by which we structure our reality. So what Einstein was talking about, our optical illusion of consciousness, the paradigms are the way that we understand the way the thing works. Over time, what happens is, according to Kuhn, the paradigm is so integrated into our consciousness, into our psyche, into our worldview, that it becomes invisible to us as a way of thinking about it, and it becomes the reality itself for all intents and purposes, until it's challenged by some revolutionary development external to the paradigm that says maybe that paradigm doesn't work anymore. So an example of that, late medieval age, there were scientists thinking maybe the world, the earth, is not the center of the universe. The paradigm that was invisible for centuries was the earth was the center of the universe. And only when someone got outside of it and did something so revolutionary, oh, there was a pun, wasn't it? Revolutionary. I was just seeing who was paying attention there. So revolutionary that they went to prison for it. They were excommunicated for it. They, in some cases, their lives were shortened because of it. That's the kind of notion of paradigm shift. The problem is that we will keep trying to make the old paradigm work at all costs. When it doesn't, what we find is that our world starts crumbling around us. And it creates all that anxiety, all that fear. What Denise Breton and Chris Largent say is soul abuse. We start beating up ourselves to say, this world isn't making sense to us. Paradigms are prevalent that we just don't even think about. We think there is a way to do education, right? Schools. Schools are the way we do it. We have a paradigm of education via schools. We have a paradigm of the way we nurture children and families. We have a paradigm of the way governments promote the public good. We have a paradigm of the business managing shared resources, of religious institutions inspiring us and helping us fulfill life's purpose. Except every one of those paradigms fail. They fail on occasion, and they ultimately all will fail in one way or another. Right? Is that making sense? I'm seeing a few nodding heads. Let me see a few more. Yeah? All right. The conclusion, though, is for Kuhn, is that prevailing models or paradigms stymie change. The institutional inertia is that when they become invisible, well, it's just the way we've always done it. Have you ever heard that in church? Have you ever heard that in school or in your workplace? It's just the way we've always done it, which is just a different way of saying the paradigm has become the reality. Breton and Largent go on to say there's actually a paradigm conspiracy, that as long as the paradigm remains invisible, then we were stuck, and we will resist change. We will resist it with all of our being. And if we try to move into a new direction, the old paradigm intimidates us to abandon it and go back to what they suggest is soul-diminishing behavior, We do that either with a perpetual loop back to what hasn't worked before, but it's the thing we know, and so we keep going back to it. Or we try to kickstart into a revolution, but by definition, a revolution has all sorts of unknowns. We can't know all of the elements of what's out there that's not been tried yet. We'll talk more about how those soul-diminishing activities of dealing with a paradigm shift. We'll talk more in the 5th week about how that translates into addictions, which we all have. We might want to call them addictive inclinations, not addictions, diagnostically, but we all have the sense of being attached to things that are not life-giving and needing to come through into a new paradigm of recovery that involves resilience. So that's what we'll talk about later. But now I want to go and spend just a few minutes on a paradigm shift. So what these folks are proposing, and I would concur with and suggest to you, is that we are invited in this servant leadership, in this spirituality and leadership, we are invited into the work of paradigm shift. I'm not telling you what that paradigm is or what the shift needs to be, but I want to give you the narrative by which we might be able to make sense of that. And remember that servant leadership is about God's dream for a transformed world. So now we're going to go to the second handout, which is the one that talks about Egypt and empire on the front page. So have you got that? Let me stop and just say, any questions or comments at this point before we jump into this? Yes, Susan.
Is this going to be recorded so if we miss one week we can look at it?
Tonight is going to be recorded, and we hope that the rest will be recorded, but to be determined. Yeah. Yep, Betsy.
Just that what Einstein's describing, I think, is a later, more mature stage that people, human beings, need to differentiate first and become separate individuals before they can then realize that we're part of a greater system.
So the comment, if I capture it correctly, Betsy, correct me if I'm wrong, is that the work involved to get where Einstein is talking about being released from the prison of our optical illusions is the work of differentiation,
Yes.
which is another technical word. It's a therapeutic word as well, but it has to do with the deep inner work that we're talking about.
Right, and I think in that process we do become the illusion of being separate is necessary for a while, or is part of. You can't differentiate without seeing yourself as separate, and what he's talking about is that's an illusion.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm getting something out of this.
You know, maybe in that 5th week we'll deal with that more in more detail. I would argue that differentiation is not about individualism. It's not. In fact, it's just the opposite. It's differentiation so that we can let all of our guards down and recognize who we truly are. It's differentiating the false self from the true self. It's differentiating from what is shadow to what is light. It's differentiating from what is true to what is false to what is true. And none of that is about standing off from something else. That's the way I would interpret it.
So I think I'm using the therapeutic term for childhood bonding with parents and then slowly becoming separate.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Which are models that obviously I'm immersed in those as well as a physician. But those models are about external appropriation of the world. And what I'm talking about is a different way of seeing the world based on who we understand ourselves to be.
And I'm just saying that's more of a mature. It'd be interesting to explore whether a child can go there or not.
Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah. Alan, did you have something and then we'll move on?
Brief note, something that I read years ago that was worked with this lady said that I can understand. Scott Peck, I guess he was a pop psychologist. He said something about how
Yeah, yeah. So identity work is an important part of the maturation. Fair enough. Thank you for that distinction.
Hey, Steve, can I ask a question?
Yep.
When you talk about a paradigm that's operative that we may not be aware of, is that the same thing as the stories that we tell ourselves about why things are the way they are?
As an example, do you have one that comes to mind?
Starting out in business, when I worked in finance, there was the sense that the way that a person became respected and advanced was to do things a certain way. That there was like one model for how a person succeeded.
Yeah.
And so that was a story that everyone told themselves, and so that was what they marched along when, in fact, everyone had different gifts. And so where you actually got to have more responsibility and pleasure in what you were doing was by using those gifts rather than trying to follow that narrative about what made someone successful.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Or to generalize that statement, we have a paradigm in this nation that the harder you work, the more successful you're going to be.
That's still not true.
But it's propagated. It is propagated in our myth as a nation.
So the task is being aware of what the myth is that's running your sense of self.
The paradigms are always there. And if you replace a paradigm, you're going to have another paradigm. We don't know how to cogitate on this without having the mental models that Kuhn is calling paradigms. All that we're trying to get to is that the paradigm always comes up short. Sooner or later, every one of them will, including religion. There is no religion that's got it all figured out. And so this journey that we call life is about unfolding into new paradigms, trying them on, trying to figure out how they work, but it's never getting rid of all the paradigms. It's being aware of them and of their shortcomings, of how they benefit us, but also their shortcomings. And then, is there a way to rethink the thing? I mean, 100 years ago, Einstein was beginning his work in relativity, and it changed the way we think of time. There was no concept of the notion of bending time prior to that. Still boggles my mind to think about. But that now has been largely replaced in the world of physics with new paradigms that say it isn't linear the way that Einstein thought it was, even if it bent linearly. It is string, and it is worm, and it is black hole, and it is words that I can't even pronounce. And so the paradigms are out there to invite us into it. And what happens is the institutional default is to say hogwash on that, right? I mean, that's what the church does. The church is the most conservative institution of them all, and it's the last to come around to a notion of evolution or a notion of women having full capacity in leadership roles. What's that? Global warming, whatever the case may be. So, all right, Pat, and then we're moving on.
Just so that people know, you can get a whole culture of institution into the idea of servant leaderhood. It becomes a paradigm, and then they have to fight that. I did that in Krista years ago. And for 5 years, we worked towards servant leadership, and then we realized that we made a lot of it.
Yeah. All right. So with that, that's the great segue. So now I want to talk about this. And this is where we're talking inductive and narrative versus just a deductive or reductive. You learn a certain you learn a certain set of tenets or principles, and then you're good to go. You ace the test, and then you're good to go. This is about living something different. And we're going to use the story of the book of Exodus. Y'all know the book of Exodus, right? Or at least you know Cecil B. DeMille's 10 Commandments. But you know, the people of God, the Hebrews, the Israelites, landed in Egypt for many good reasons, but over time, they lost what those paradigmatic reasons were, and they found themselves in bondage. We're going to talk at a metaphorical level, at a biblical level, at a metaphorical or allegorical level, and then we're going to try to see how does this play into what we're talking about in terms of servant leadership. So Egypt, empire, is this image of fear drives everything. And fear drives into control, that there is this construct that happens. The paradigm of the empire is about power and prestige and possessions. And everything gets commodified. That's what slavery is commodification of everything. From possessions to prestige to power. And there is this sense that with the fear comes the anxiety, and when you don't measure up, there's self-rejection or shame that come as a result of it. And everything in the commodification is power over something else. If someone's got power over you, you need to make damn sure you got power over someone else. And so the foreman on the Hebrew slave gang is beating the people down below him, and so forth. And someone goes home and kicks the child, and the child goes and kicks the dog, and right, metaphorically, you know this. But everything gets commodified, and so what happens is the commodification gets translated into attachment to things that are not life-giving. Attachment. Attachment is one of the things we'll look at later on. It leads to cynicism. Is this all that life has to offer? It leads to paranoia. Who's going to take my control, my power away? It leads to that shame and that utter desire to control. Right? And so then God comes along, and I just got to move here. I just can't even sit still with this narrative. God comes along and says, follow me. Follow me somewhere else. Follow me to do it differently. And that's this kingdom of God side on the right side. That's the language we use as Christians. But in the Hebrew text, in the Exodus text, it's about moving to the promised land, right? And so they leave in heading into the promised land, but they don't get there. It takes 40 years. When you hear 40 years in the Bible, hear a long damn time. That's what it means. It means a lifetime. This is a lifetime's journey worth of work. You don't ever get this all figured out. That's the invitation of this narrative of the Exodus. It isn't that 40 years and you got it all figured out. I turned 52 this week, and I don't have it all figured out. Not by a long shot, because 40 years is proverbial, it's metaphorical for a lifetime. A lifetime. But the invitation is to taste the promised land, to taste the manna, to drink the water when you're so parched for anything that's life-giving, to drink the water that spews from the rock, to eat the meat of the quail when you're so famished that you cannot even think straight. And know that those are gifts given for you in that very moment. And in that moment, because it isn't good the next day. You got to trust that something else is going to be there the next day. You can't hoard it in the way you did back in the empire. Now, some folks on this journey, again in the book of Exodus, some folks in this journey decide, this desert stuff is hard. This journey is hard. This wilderness experience of moving into something else, it's hard. I want to go back to the flesh pots of Egypt. I want to go back to where my friends are. I want to go back to where I knew what everything was. The paradigm was there, and I knew what it was, and I'm back into that soul diminishing, that soul abusive track. You get the connection with what Kuhn was saying? But if you persist on, the invitation is to live into this collaborative, this creative, this compassion-driven, this communal experience that we call the kingdom of God, the community of God, the presence and active engagement of one another within that divine framework. We move from just trying to survive on the left-hand side of the page to resurrection, a new paradigm on the other side of the page. Resurrection makes no sense whatsoever under the paradigm of you're born, you live, you die, and it's done. And if that's the paradigm by which you live, then possession and power and prestige becomes uber important to try to hold on to. But if you live into a new paradigm that says, God's up to something here, and God's inviting me into something to be unfolded over a lifetime, then resurrection becomes a new paradigm that can be revolutionary. Is this making sense? Y'all get the biblical, metaphorical, and how it applies to us? All right? So, what I want to do is spend 10 or 15 minutes in conversation, and then we'll come back together. I want you to approach these three questions that have to do with this primarily. And I should say the second page, the three central practices of servant leadership, is part of that transition of communion, creation, compassion as well. We'll deal with that some more later on. Bring these back with you week by week, because we'll unfold over time and we'll keep referring back to this narrative. But now I want you to get in pairs, and as has become our custom in these Cathedral Commons, spend some time listening one to the other, and then after a period of time I'll call switch, and that's time for you to come back around to the other. Now you can do it question one person, the other person, question two, one person, the other person, or you can do question 1, 2, and 3, one person, question 1, 2, and 3, the other person. Y'all figure that out. But deal with these, and then we'll report back. Does that make sense? I've got a few wrinkled brows. Any questions about that? All right, so we'll come back at 10 till the hour. Thank you. So let's spend just a few minutes back in plenary and talk about the questions or about your conversations, what you feel comfortable sharing of what you shared with your partner. Thoughts on all this? Yes.
So my partner and I had a question about schema and paradigm, and how those relate are in your understanding, if you're seeing them as the same or not. And we got into quite an interesting talk about how those two relate, your personal schema and the paradigm in which you live, and do they have to be the same? And to do the work that we're talking about, does one come out of, I was thinking along the lines of, well, you would be coming out of your own personal schema, but how would you comment?
Yeah. It's a good question. And I guess a lot depends on what's meant by schema as well. For me, when I hear that word, I think diagrammed system. I think a system that's been diagrammed in some way. That's what I think when I think of schema. And that's back to the deductive model. The paradigm shift, again, if we're thinking this inductive model, this narrative model, it's about changing the story, which will inform the schema, if we want to use that language. But it's more bedrock than that. It's more narrative. It's changing the soup in which the schema, the system can take its shape.
We were understanding, at least I was understanding schema as one's own personal, I misunderstood, one's own personal paradigm, if you will. And then paradigm as more systemic, like a society.
Yeah.
Paradigm is the macro and the schema is the individual interpretations based, of course, on our own life experiences.
Okay, all right. And so were y'all able to hear that? The schema is the individual term for the paradigm, which would be the more comprehensive or meta term. Sure. Yeah. Others? Yeah.
I began our discussion by saying,
Will you stand up and project this way?
I began by saying this sentence, I said, I can't change your mind. Having said that, I'm very persuasive.
So he's saying you can't change someone else's mind. I think that's absolutely, and of course that's not what we're talking about here. Right. Thank you. Others?
We talked about
Margaret?
the societal paradigm impairing or hindering us from realizing our sexuality for many, many years.
Societal's paradigm
But when we were told about
hinders.
being homosexual versus heterosexual was sort of badness or goodness,
Yeah.
kept us from realizing ourselves for many years.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. And clearly, if we come back around again to institutional inertia, where is it hardest to break off of that, out of that older paradigm? In institutions like the church that hold on to something that says can't happen. We can't figure it out without the old paradigm. Yeah.
I'd like to follow on, because even though that would be applicable to
Philip, will you stand up and speak out this way?
I'd like to follow on, because even though we talked about that would be applicable to both of us, I realized after that paradigm shift, then I spent 20 years in another paradigm that was totally locking me down, which was that surely there was no religion worth really spending any time with. Because even if, right, I found religions, I could look them up on the internet, that were perfectly fine with me and everyone else I could think. But they just weren't as intellectual as I liked. Or they were, I don't know, I could always come up with a reason.
Right.
Right? Because I wanted somebody to say, no, this is it. This is absolutely it. You can rely on this until the end and beyond. And that was a paradigm. It totally blew me down. So it was a huge shift just 2 years ago for me to realize, you mentioned how exhausting it can be to hold up the paradigms.
Yeah, this is.
You guys are here, right? And I just got tired of it. I was exhausted demanding perfection out of the church. It was a huge deal. I'm still, as I said, I'm still reeling from not demanding perfection anymore. It's very hard. It's very hard.
Thank you both for sharing that. It's powerful. Other thoughts? Yes, Lynn.
We talked about how the paradigms tend to serve certain populations better than others, and that a lot of times to move from one to the other, the impetus originates in those for whom it doesn't work. Like for example, in the time of Egypt, Moses could have continued to suck up the Pharaoh and then the next Joseph and just attract his people and just said, oh. But it wasn't until he followed the structure that he actually identified with his own people and moved from here.
Were y'all able to hear that? It's powerful, and I immediately went to the suffrage movement a century ago.
And women's suffrage, civil rights,
Go ahead.
I can say more about my point. I'll try to project, or maybe I should move a little bit, acoustics are really weird here. That the impetus to move from this paradigm to this paradigm doesn't originate with those for whom the paradigm works. So there's always people in the population for whom the paradigm works better than others. So as Steve just said, for the suffragettes or the suffragists, the paradigm obviously didn't work for them because they weren't able to vote. Or civil rights, it didn't work for them because they weren't given equal rights. Or any movement toward a more complete paradigm or a more perfect union originates with people who don't have the power a lot of the time, or have less power.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Yeah, Betsy.
Well, Ruth and I were talking about our own personalities and the paradigms that have kept us kind of locked into a way of viewing ourselves and our effectiveness in the world, and realizing that it's really a hard shift to make, to own a different person in yourself than the one you believed for so many years, and then just really act out of this person you have become, but haven't acknowledged.
Thank you for sharing that, Betsy, and it prompts me to say that we're not cutting off just yet, but on your tables are copies of the article by Parker Palmer, Leading from Within. Hits right on, square on the head of the nail there, so thank you for that. Do take a copy home and read it in advance of next week. We'll use that as the backdrop for our conversation next week. Karin, were you going to say something?
Well, I have to really respect my partner by hearing her say that trying to make a paradigm shift can be facilitated by being in community. That it's not a solo act, or as much harder as a solo act. And that was the first time
So I don't know if you were able to hear that, but that making the paradigm shift is sometimes easier if you're in community. I would argue it can't be done without community. Yeah, Bob.
Yeah. So what I shared with Carolyn was that I really decided to focus much on how I was trapped in my own paradigm initially when I was working as a critical care nurse, and I saw myself as a really good technician around end-of-life care. And so when we needed to withdraw life support technology, and the family had made that decision, I was very good about making sure the lights were quiet, and people had tissues and using, whatever they needed, but I didn't really have a feeling or a relate. So when people would be falling apart or crying, I really couldn't understand what was happening. And my paradigm ultimately was about protecting myself and distancing myself, because when you work in a trauma center and you see that, 3 to 4 shifts a week, you kind of go, I can't be that present. And then I shared that it was the loss of my mother that really then shifted into then be fully present. And then thinking about going into the coming weeks or next weeks, the struggle that I have now is moving from this personal narrative of presence, but how do you do that in organized structures and systems like complicated healthcare systems, where there is power differentials that are very well spoken, but many of them so unspoken today. And how do you then be present to that and navigate and live within that, and do that in a way that serves your narrative well, as compared to not serving well. So it's kind of like my next goal too.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that too. What tender sharing, and then to be able to describe the challenge of working within an institution, a system that is complicated and is never going to be perfect. Because I know who you are and the way you lead in a place like that, there is hope for it to evolve, to move at least partly away from the left to the right.
I think it's very dark right now.
Well, let me just say that all right, let's just say it. There's a lot of darkness in the world right now, and it's being manifest in a lot of different ways, not least of which is in the places of work. But let me also say that as one who has dedicated his life to working within the church, we have the capacity to go dark just as easily. We have to be continually reminded that we like to hold on to our paradigms. And I can, with the best of them or the worst of them, however you see it, go to that left-hand side, and my leadership becomes management and control and power. And my ego, back to that narcissism challenge that we all have in our world today, and my ego can go right to the heart of needing the prestige of knowing that I'm the one in charge. And knowing that. We were talking as a staff yesterday about this renewing our covenant, this statement that we've adopted and that we are embracing, how it has unleashed us, broken us free of some institutional inertia to really begin to think about how we are being faithful as the church in a world that is really broken and hurting. But at the same very moment, we have the risk in this place of being really smug with ourselves over this statement.
You're talking this statement about how we're going to fight
Yep.
racism.
Yep. We can get really smug, and I've had interactions, conversations with people, and I've had some of it myself. I mean, I'm proud of what we're doing.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily bad, but it can go bad really quickly when my ego is thinking, we are all that. Right? Yep.
May I suggest that an antidote to what you're just, that possibility, that dark possibility that we all have, is to actually enflesh what we're talking about, because to actually get out and put our bodies on the line will help us overcome all that, I think. I think when the more we really walk the talk, the more we will live the difficulty of it, and it will be very humbling.
Yeah. Thank you for that. All right, Alan, and then we'll wrap it up.
What she just said is true, but it's kind of scary, because I said something weeks ago about the kind of civil rights movement all over again, and I'm just wondering, if we follow what you said, it's like, okay, where do we go find our head in the heads bridge and get our heads cracked by the police? That's the bridge where the civil rights protesters got their heads cracked. I mean, that seems to be what we're talking about.
That is
And that's pretty scary to actually,
that is,
if you got children,
Yeah.
go on and get hurt. I'm not disagreeing with this, I'm pretty scared.
Well, maybe we can continue. All right, Deborah. Yeah, you'll.
Well, I think we have to communicate, and that there's a safety. We're just called to be salt and light, not battering ram. And that's a very different kind of servant leadership. And redefining power and allowing ourselves to be melty, willing to melt on icy surfaces, or, light, dark place. I think that in itself is a paradigm shift of how do we have to be. There is a construct for servant leaderships that says front of the line, but we're kind of washing feet and being salt and looking for the place where there's not a lot of glamour. Where is it boots on the ground and boots are dirty?
Yeah.
So I think there's a safety in that if we're willing to construct our lives so that we focus on
Yeah. Thanks for saying that. Maybe just to summarize, it's not an either or. It's a both and. And the both and is a really ambiguous place to be, which again moves from one paradigm into another, and says, can we figure this out and live with the anxious change and all of that?
Steve, can I just say that when I go to see people in their homes in rural Pierce or Kitsap County, where they all have Fox TV on, and they're not like me at all, but I walk in and say, I'm a doctor and I'm here to take care of your mother, I can engage these people in a way that we don't have to deal with our politics, we don't have to deal with what's by then, they like me.
Right.
And-
So compassion is the seed for the relationship there. Yeah, good. Well, I have a sense that this could go on for a lot longer tonight. We'll continue to unfold and unpack things. Do read the Leading from Within article for next week. Bring back your Egypt to Kingdom page 2, because we'll continue to use that and refer back to it. If you have a chance to stay and help break down tables and chairs, great. If not, no problems. But as you know, 30 women called this place home who are experiencing homelessness tonight. So the Lord be with you. Let us pray. Gracious God, as we leave tonight, may we trust and know that you are with us, blessing us on our ways to the places where we go now. Help us to integrate your narrative of love, of compassion, of communion, of creation into our work as servant leaders who bear the name Christ as we go about our lives. Amen. Thank you all.